But Kiff is an artist who has made jewelry since 1970, but she is not a jeweler. Her works have been guided by her interest in history, poetry, and mythology, a range of ideas that have also drawn her to a range of materials, silver, paper, whatever. She has exhibited extensively throughout the world, and most recently, she has a piece in a body adorned at the Met. Major collections, we already know, are throughout the world. In an article in 1993, she is quoted that she creates for the mind as well as for the body. I would like you to respond to that.
I like to make jewelry that makes you think as well as feel. And I'm thinking about, I guess it was in the 70s when the rage for statements became what people wanted to hear. They wanted to have you sum up your work in, 2 lines, which is very much a part of culture today. And it was always very hard for me to do that. And mostly I would prefer to say something about a particular piece because I didn't work within a certain style. And I worked across a range of ideas and materials. So finally, after so much pestering about doing this, I did come up with something to say, which was that I wrote. And it was something like, imagine wearing a necklace of ice. After a long evening, all that remains is a memory and a sensation. In other words, I wanted to spark the imagination of the viewer in some way, and that jewelry could do that. And also to counter certain assumptions about preciousness and about smallness, about that small things could be about big things, and that the scale and there was a certain burden of jewelry because it's a vast field. And I must say that I never would have imagined that I would be making jewelry because I didn't see how it could involve the intellectual side of my life. And also my wanting to connect with other cultures, other people, and through art, and advocate for art in some way. That's a long answer.
Well, it's not a long answer at all, but actually, through your jewelry, you did advocate for ideas. I have noticed that you have had many bodies of work, and they have had sort of titles like Alchemy or Insectopedia or Hands of Heroes, and all those titles and all those collective identifications in some way lead you into a certain kind of intellectual thought. I am particularly interested in the fact of Hands of Heroes because when I first saw them, that I sort of rejected them. I'm not very proud of that, but I'm very honest to say that when I first opened them, I thought, oh my God, no. And now I would give anything to have one. Right. And I remember it was a very rainy afternoon. But
and I remember you liked the box that I sent them in.
But I think you should talk about Hands of Heroes because they delve into Russian constructivism, poetry, literature, music, and they are all identified with major figures in the history of our time. Mm-hmm. Would you like to talk about? In fact, I brought the cover of Metalsmith that shows Hands of Heroes, right? Mm-hmm. And then I brought, I couldn't believe that I had it, in sectopedia card with, in fact, each alphabet has a different insect is identified with a different insect. So I'd like you to discuss this collective energy that you put to a body of work.
I think for maybe 10 years I practice making jewelry. In a way, it's sort of like doing scales, maybe, learning through actually working rather than studying with anyone. But then I thought, this really isn't the purely decorative aspect of jewelry is not what appealed to me. However, beauty and a kind of aesthetic intention does matter, and it can also argue for something larger. And so I needed to find some way to almost literally torque my thoughts into making something. And I learned early on that I couldn't, it seemed to take many things to make one thing, to talk about ideas. So with the hands that you mentioned, I was actually asked a question in an interview by Robert Lee Morris, who were my childhood heroes. And I thought, and most of the other questions were not all that interesting, but I thought, well, this will be good to answer. And then when it came to answering the question, I couldn't think of one. And I found this rather disturbing. And I thought that really in other cultures, you would probably find many people answering with the same answer of who a hero was in their culture. And it occurred to me that we don't have a very deep mythological past. And that is something very different in America, and that what would a hero mean other than someone who was exceptionally physically strong and a good leader? And so I started to ask other people this question, and the answer, I never got the same answer, except for two people said Eleanor Roosevelt, which was quite interesting. I didn't find a way to characterize her, but I also wanted to use the image of the hand as a way of being part of a legacy of art making from the beginning, putting your hand on the cave wall and blowing dust and leaving your print. And it ranges across many cultures. So I wanted to take an iconic image and then work with that same image to create portraits in a way. It was a kind of hagiography of heroes. But these weren't all my heroes, but other people's definition. And through that, I could also use different materials that I could use those metaphorically. And that's another way I have come to work with. So the hands really opened up a way of working that I've followed a lot until now. And when I sent Helen, I mean, it was rather cheeky and maybe naive that I thought, well, the place to send these, because I felt they were good and important would be to Helen. And I showed them in Seattle because I wanted to show them as a group, because it wasn't a single one that had to do with these ideas. And, but of course, I'd never shown with Helen before. I'm sure you didn't know any of my work at that time. And so that was fine, because then I wrote to Garth Clark, who had a gallery in New York at that time, and he was beginning to show jewelry. And then he took the show, the group, to show it that way. And then I could not keep them all together and sell them as one piece, but I really did think of them as one piece.
But didn't you sell Insectopedia as one piece?
I did.
Yes, which is great. And I also learned that being in the gallery, I could learn from my mistakes. And that was a very, very important moment for me, because I realized, within a month or two that I had erred. But also my childhood hero was Brenda Starr. Because she was a girl reporter. And I thought that was pretty neat. It was not only Brenda Starr, but it was also the turtle and the hare. It was also anybody in Aesop's Fables was sort of somebody I admired. But Brenda Starr was really important. How many of you remember Brenda Starr?
I remember her, but for me it was Wonder Woman.
Wonder Woman? Okay.
Totally.
So could you say a little bit about Brenda Starr?
Yes, she was a girl reporter, in a man's world. She was working for a newspaper. She had an important position. She was an investigatory reporter. And, I'm talking about I was born in 1930, so I'm talking about 1935. Who knew about girl reporters in 1935 when you were surrounded with Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret? So here was somebody very different, from a different social class, having a job, getting paid, and
wearing earrings with stars.
Right. So,
Yeah. But see, it kind of fits.
Right.
Still.
No.
It does.
It was interesting, and the whole concept of heroes is interesting. I know that this has nothing to do with our conversation, but I'm going to tell it anyway. Many years ago, when I was in Amsterdam, and I went to Anne Frank's house, and there was a room in back of her house, in back of her bedroom, which was her room with her wall, and all her heroes from the 30s were cut out. Princess Margaret Rose, Shirley Temple, Clark Gable, and I suddenly realized that only an ocean between us gave me life and gave her death. But those heroes were the same heroes that we would have cut out in the United States on our own soil. I know this has nothing to do
but Anne Frank is certainly one.
Right.
I mean, that affected me deeply, reading her diary as a teenager, and then later reading her and recognizing her as a writer. And when they were going to have to move and go into hiding, she paused and said it was either books or dresses. And she chose books. So
in a way, she was a hero.
She was, absolutely.
I'm also curious how you became so interested in Russian literature and Russian constructivism.
For some strange reason, my parents didn't really read to me as a kid, and I didn't have books too much. And it's funny to think back about that, because my father was an avid reader. But anyway, I did have a record of Peter and the Wolf, and I listened to that incessantly. And I connect a lot with that feeling of being scared and excited and knowing things. I mean, the conflicts that are there, because I didn't want to see the wolf killed either, but also seeing the tension between the music and the text, and that all affected me a lot. And then when I was starting to read Nancy Drew mysteries in the library, which was a small town library, when I think of it now, this woman who was the librarian, who had never married, and she saw that I took to books, and she said, "You might like reading some Russian literature." I was in 5th grade. and so I read it. But also at that same time, in 5th grade, one of the teachers read Kipling, and Rikki Tikki Tavi was, again, another book that that affected me. So I started reading Russian books, and that was actually what I was thinking I would do when I went to college. I was studying comparative literature in French and Russian, and something about the Russian soul, I guess, came through those books. Absolutely. Even though I, of course, read them much later and wondered what I possibly was getting, but I was reading them all the way through, and I would tough it out even though I didn't understand it always.
Before I ask you about Francisco Toledo, I'm just curious about the title for this body of work, Protection and Gift. What does that really mean?
Mm-hmm. It means a lot of things. It means what I think jewelry can be about and what art can be about. Certainly in jewelry history, a lot of jewelry's function was as protection, as in amulet form and gift. So the protection part, we can certainly connect with jewelry, and I like that function of jewelry. And I think in a way you see that much more in so-called ethnic cultures and in non-industrial societies, I like to say, who understood that and used jewelry for that purpose. And certainly in the Plains Indian breastplate, which I'm very much referring to in these pieces, that was symbolic armor. Obviously, it wasn't anything that was physically functioning as armor, but it also became, I like the edge between ceremony and function. And I think that jewelry is often attributed as the earliest form, the earliest evidence of symbolic thought, because it was made most likely for that purpose, for protection. And the gift part of it has many layers to it. I feel that artists who are working as artists and caring about the culture already give us gifts in their work. And it has been other jewelry, other art that has nourished me all my life. And I would like to think that my work could perform that function as well. And that the give and take, the reciprocity of working and making in this culture is very important. And it's keeping that in balance, because I have received much from other cultures that I am very attracted to and certainly refer to a lot in my work. And I want to give something as well. And, you know, in 19th century, I think they were called devices, little sayings that were connected with images that they might put on cups or lockets, and one of them was esteem the giver. And I like that phrase, even the old-fashioned use of esteem the giver. And I always put that at the end of the books I have made, because it was from gifts of other people that I was able to produce something. But also, most importantly, because often people who care about my work or seeing work don't necessarily have the means to own it. And that's part of why I also like to show in an exhibition sense, so that it can be owned by the viewer. I mean, so much art that means something to me I don't own, but I have the experience of seeing it. And that's why I like to have a complete exhibition, so that is available in that way. That's another way of jewelry's use. So in that sense, the artist gives a lot to kind of put your deeper thoughts and ideas out into the world. So
another way of looking at the use of gift is Lewis Hyde says that a gift becomes more powerful when it is passed on to somebody else. And that is something that happens in the world of ornament, that, you know, ornaments are hopefully are passed on to another generation, unless in today's world they're sold, you know, at auction. But traditionally, jewelry was passed on from one generation to another before the commercial world really captured it. And so the idea of gift has symbolically many, many different meanings.
it does.
Yeah.
And even in a very particular way with Mexico, when Cortez landed in Veracruz, and Moctezuma, who was the Aztec ruler at that time, received this news, he was trying to decide whether they send gifts or soldiers. And they decided on gifts, and those gifts, among them, those gifts was a necklace of gold, tiny gold crabs that I'm sure were beautifully made, and books. And as we know, all of these beautiful books that they were making in the various cultures in Mexico were burned by the Spanish, and there are 14 that have remained. So books and jewelry.
Right. Do you think John Paul Miller knew about the crab necklace?
I only
wonder.
learned of that recently. I only learned about the crab necklace.
I wonder if in his research, is it still in existence? It would be interesting to find out. You should know that, Thomas. No. In the year 2000, I believe, Francesco Toledo invited you to become part of the Taller de Paper in Oaxaca. So I'm curious, first, why were you in Oaxaca? What brought you to Oaxaca? And then how did that invitation from Francisco occur, and under what circumstances?
Rod and I, my husband Rod and I, first went to Oaxaca 50 years ago. and we were both students and working 5 jobs between us, and I thought it was time to have a break. But of course, we had no money. We were buying on credit from the farm down the road. Milk and eggs is what we usually ate at the end of the month because we could just write what we owed when we'd get paid. So it was tight, but also in another farmhouse down the road was an abandoned house where we stopped. This is a very long answer, but it's
great.
maybe interesting. And this house, we went to pick black raspberries we saw that were there. And we asked the neighboring farmer if it seemed okay if we went to pick the raspberries. He said, "Oh, you can go in there." And he said, "No one has lived there for years. And the owners are elsewhere and they've never come back." So we, of course, looked in the house, and there were many things there, as though they were going to leave, and then they didn't. And there were old photographs that my husband immediately was interested in, and there was a beaded curtain of Peking glass beads that had broken and was splayed on the floor. I mean, the idea of Peking glass beaded curtain in an Iowa farmhouse was a potent image to me then. But I scooped up some of the beads, and I thought, well, if we need a break, we can drive to Mexico. And if I could make something at the student art fair, and we could maybe make enough money to take off. So I didn't know anything about jewelry, and I don't even remember why I thought of this, but I went to the hardware store and got some brass wire and some tin snips and a couple pairs of pliers, and I made 150 pairs of earrings with those beads. And of course, they were not soldered or anything, but I also learned something there that I couldn't stand to make the same thing twice. So that was good to know. But I sold all the earrings, $300, so we went to Oaxaca. We drove to Mexico, and then we had nothing in mind, but we kept driving and stopping and looking around till we finally reached Oaxaca. And it seemed like a wonderful town. And one day we went to get coffee in the square, and there was no one there, which seemed so strange. And we said, "Well, where is everybody?" And they said, "Well, they're at a poetry reading at the stadium." Well, this made a big impression also, that people would care about that much. Many years later, we heard Seamus Haney reading in the little courtyard of the Institute of Graphic Arts, where people were standing on the roofs, and it was totally packed to hear his poems in English and Spanish, and actually Danish at that time, because a Danish book, a publisher had published his book. Anyway, so we were there for 2 weeks. By the time we got to Oaxaca, we actually stayed there 3 whole days. And at that time, I saw the jewelry from Tomb 7, which was excavated at Monte Alban, a Zapotec site. And it was incredible jewelry, made of all different kinds of materials. Gold and silver, obviously, but coral, shell, and both abstract, representational. It made an impression. I didn't run home and say, "Oh, I'm going to make jewelry," but obviously that did affect me. And after 25 years, we decided to go back to Oaxaca, and there was a wonderful library. Much had changed. There was a wonderful library in the Museum of Contemporary Art that was full of very beautiful art books. And people couldn't check out the books, but they came to look at the books. This was all Francisco Toledo. He not only founded the museum, but the library, and they were his books that he gave. And it was obviously for the community. And his idea then was, this is before the internet really, so that people could see these things and didn't have to leave to see these things. And we were very impressed by that. And the next year we each brought 50 pounds of books each to give to the library, and including some catalogs, and there were a couple of jewelry books. And one of the books was a book of Lee Friedlander photographs. So Toledo asked Rod if he would do a show of Lee's work in Oaxaca. Rod said, I'll ask. He had done a show. And Lee said yes, so they came to Oaxaca, and there was this exhibition. That's how it started.
But how did you get incorporated into the paper workshop? And how did the paper workshop really act as a catalyst for the body of work that we see today? You know, how did these dyes come? Where did the colors come from? Did you roll these papers? Who's making the papers? I think it would be really interesting to know what was the source and what was the birth of this exhibition, and how did it happen?
Well, it was Toledo again. He has founded several institutions, and he is really a cultural activist in Mexico. He doesn't like that term, but he's also probably one of the most known and respected artists in Mexico. One of the places that he bought was an old hydroelectric plant up in the hills, and that's where the water for the city came from. There is a giant pipe that the water roars through in the paper workshop still. And he thought if he made it into a paper making place, that would give employment to the people who lived there, and that maybe it could make a go of it making paper. So but it was around maybe a year or so before he also by then we had become friends, and he said, I said that I loved this place and I loved the paper. It was beautiful. And he said, why don't you make jewelry out of paper? And I said, well, I don't know anything about paper, and I'm a metalsmith. And he said, well, I don't know anything about paper.
How could you say you're a metalsmith when you told me you're not a metalsmith?
Well, I tried to just define that as far as the material.
You're an artist.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, he recognized that already. But so he asked if I said, well, it would be interesting to work there. And then he added very quietly, of course, it would be nice if you could come up with some designs that they could reproduce. And I immediately said, oh no, I couldn't possibly do that. I don't like to make anything more than once, and I'm not very efficient. I wouldn't be good at that. He said, no problem, okay. Well, I started working there, and of course the things that I came up with were very simple, and they could make those things.
How I noticed that there's a range of colors in the papers, and you talk to me about the colors coming from the cactus, from the juice of the cactus. Is that correct?
it's not the colors, but the sizing, of the pulp. And the other thing that Toledo wanted to do was have these materials be sustainable, and that the paper was made from plants that grew in the area, not from trees. And that part of it was experimenting with that, to use these different plants combined with cotton from a gigantic textile mill that was up the hill from there, that made, it was also abandoned, and then there were huge bales of cotton in the mill. So they started with that. But what he really wanted was that all the paper be made with the indigenous plants. And they had different colors without being dyed. But of course, you can hardly be in Mexico and not want color. And certainly the artisans were interested in that. So there were aniline dyes used also. And so many of the pieces downstairs have the very subtle colors are usually there is a native cotton in Mexico, and they are natural fibers. And they are also growing. When they wanted to make paper with flax, which is linen, they grow the flax.
And these cone-like elements that, are combined in order to achieve your pieces and your I don't even want to call them necklaces or neck pieces, but the shields. In the fabrication of that paper, the paper must be very pliable.
Mm-hmm.
Or do you cut it in order to get these pellets?
Mm-hmm.
And
it's the rolled beads are certainly not my invention. They were used in Victorian times, often with leftover wallpaper. And my only contribution was inking the edges. And for me, paper and ink, I didn't want to cover up the paper, but it's hard to show very much with the scale of jewelry being small. But the paper could be made in all different thicknesses, and each different material, fiber, had different character, and you would use it in different ways. So
I was also surprised to see that some of the paper pieces had metal ornaments. Are these metal ornaments fabricated by you, or are these found pieces that you have added to the shields?
Both.
Both.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we know?
Well, it says in the label.
It does say in the label. All right. So you're honest.
Absolutely. I mean, why not?
You don't say found
Is there
object.
a reason to apologize?
Of course, I didn't know. Absolutely.
I have been confronted with that problem many times.
What?
With using found objects. Just that devalues it for people, that you are using something already made. I'm using the metaphor that might bring about by using another object.
Do you think that the use of pencils in some strange way might be identified with your father,
Mm-hmm.
who was an editor, is that
Mm-hmm.
correct? And who constantly had pencils and kept pencils, and did
Yes.
he also keep rulers? I'm just wondering about the use of rulers and pencils.
My material inheritance from my father was 2 pencils that long, and his his steel plate that was used to take out in type for the newspaper. It would be the words were printed in metal, and they were in little slivers that were made into columns. And I liked very much that Karen asked me if there was any connection, because actually the columns, the size, the scale in the breastplate pieces are very much like those columns of type. So I grew up with metal and ink, and in the linotype machine, which I totally loved, it was producing words out of metal. And then my father would they would print, a column, and that would come on a thin strip of paper. And then he would, because I was an expert speller, he would give it to me to edit and review. And there were all these little signs that you made to say, misspelling or whatever. But I felt very serious about this job, but they were always short pencils. I guess it was because you just used them all the way down.
Here, short pencils. But also the rulers.
I don't associate the rulers, but it is scale. And the preoccupation with scale, and because jewelry is all important things seem to be said big, but of course I think that jewelry can say important things small.
I'm just curious, do you respond to commissions, or do you prefer simply to be alone in your studio and allow the ideas and your creative thoughts to take its form independently?
I don't like to do commissions too much, though I did do that to make a living in the earlier days. There were a lot of different things I had to do instead of teaching to make a living with the work. But I learned a lot from doing commissions, and very recently I was asked to make a necklace for Toledo's daughter for her wedding. And he had embroidered her dress, and her brother had embroidered the dress. He is a well-known artist, Dr. Lacra, and he had embroidered the dress she was going to wear for the reception. And so she asked if I would make her a necklace for that. Well, I was very touched that she would ask me. But it was exhausting, and but I did make it, and I actually ended up making the necklace, the earrings, and a piece for her husband to wear on his buttonhole, a pendant.
I think that the audience would be very interested in knowing your relationship to Ramona Solberg and to Ron Ho. Especially even, I know personally that when Ron was dying, that you were absolutely present during the final week of his life, which, indicates a very unusual and unique personal relationship. And Ramona as well. Would you like to speak about that?
They were dear friends and wonderful jewelers. And often I was associated with being a lesser Ramona or a lesser Ron, as though thinking that I was a student of Ramona's.
Nobody could be a lesser Ramona.
Right. But I didn't know about Ramona's work when we moved to Washington, but I was making jewelry that I was submitting to a show in Seattle, and Ramona was photographing these pieces, and the only images I have of those early pieces are what she took. Because of our interest in in ethnic jewelry. That's where it started. And beads as well, because, well, as you learned with the Peking glass, but with other beads.
Yeah, I remember that she had jars and jars of beads in her kitchen instead of jelly and pickles.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, Ramona was a wonderful jeweler, a wonderful person. I mean, I would have a lot to say about her, but she was also very down to earth and pretty hard-nosed about things, and that I appreciated especially too. And that she made jewelry for the people, and I like that as well. And we met all the time. We usually met once a week in later years to go to a little Mexican dive restaurant, and Ramona had lost a lot of her hearing at the time, and I realized that she didn't hear most of what I said. She just got whether I was in a good mood or an angry mood. But anyway, her sense of design, I mean, there are just so many things I could say about Ramona. And Ron, who was one of Ramona's students.
And they traveled together, didn't they?
They did.
And they probably bought all the ethnographic material in the Far East that ever existed, right?
Yes. They both had wonderful collections and just instilled an appreciation for this work. And really in the 70s, when I gave a talk one time and referred to my teachers being the anonymous jewelers that I had learned from these kinds of pieces that I had seen, people said to me afterwards that they admired my courage in attributing this source, like it was out of fashion to say, because that was primitive or not sophisticated. And of course, I feel totally the opposite about such work. And of course, Ramona also honored that kind of work. I'm assuming most people know her work. And Ron, then, who was Chinese, Hawaiian American, and it was Ramona who said, and we all used found material in different ways, very different ways, and Laurie Hall was also kind of part of that core of people. And I actually put together one year a show of all of us using found material in a way to show how it was very different. It wasn't just putting stuff together. And Ron, it was Ramona who said to Ron, well, why aren't you paying more attention to your Asian roots? And then he turned to using more material from Asia.
And kingfishers also. He used a lot of kingfisher material, which is totally inaccessible now. Well, I'd like you to talk about the repair and imperfection piece that you made with Ramona's gift to you. That's a very interesting project. You should really talk about the repair and imperfection project. And then if you want to talk about Ramona's piece, you can.
Well, when this photo was taken 12 or so years ago for a conference in Chicago, and it was at the Chicago Cultural Center, and they asked me if I had, the cultural center asked, the curator there asked if I had anything that I could put together for an exhibition during this conference. And I said that I was working on a current series, but I didn't know if I would have it done in time. Anyway, they wanted to do it, and that prompted me to continue working on it. I have always admired imperfection in work, though at the same time, of course, I have perfectionist tendencies, and I don't think that's always good. I would like to be a little more loose, like Ramona was. Her things weren't always perfectly crafted. It wasn't totally necessary because there was great vitality in her work. And I feel that that is often what you see in outsider art, and that imperfection can allow for a certain openness for you to fill in the blanks, so to speak. So I was trying to think of how I might just actually explore that idea. And so I decided to write to a number of other artists whose work I admired and ask them if they had anything around on their table that they'd not finished, or that they got stalled or messed up in some way, and if they would give it to me to try to finish. So right there, I had an imperfect piece. And I didn't really know what to expect, but all of the artists except one responded and sent me things, sometimes more than one piece. And the stories actually were interesting in what they sent. They didn't always include that, but Bruce Metcalf sent which was a complete signed piece, and he said he felt it needed rescuing from mediocrity.
That's true.
So that was a challenge.
Is that a continuous statement of his?
Other people would, describe maybe what they were aiming for. I know that Dan Jose said, well, I don't know. I know, I'm speaking to Dan right now. He said, I don't know if I really have anything. And he said, oh, I think I have some cast lettuce leaves that I couldn't do anything with. Well, I was very much anticipating those, but I was picturing leaf lettuce. And this was iceberg lettuce, right? And they weren't as cool as I was expecting. And they weren't, they weren't as identifiable as lettuce. Because right away I knew what I was going to do with Dan's. Because I had heard on the radio a newscast during the war in Bosnia about interviewing in this one village, and a man who said, yes, the fighting is now very close, because I woke up this morning and there were bullet casings on my lettuce leaves. And that's what happened to Dan's lettuce leaves. I had quite a time getting bullet casings that I got from a Vietnam vet turned pacifist museum curator, and who told me very carefully how I should treat those because they could still be dangerous. But I embedded the the bullet casings in the lettuce leaves. So there were many stories, and how to honor the work that the people gave me, and it invited a lot of different ways of looking, which I liked. And
it was really an extraordinary project, and now it's completely dispersed. Do you know where all these pieces are?
I mostly have them because no one was really interested in these pieces.
Really?
Because
I thought they were gone. The large chest is gone, though, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know that.
I gave one to the group of you.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
There were just a few loyal collectors who bought something. And really, again, it was one of those things where it was more what it was as a whole, that it couldn't have been kept together. But that didn't happen, and because people couldn't handle that it wasn't totally mine and totally the other. So the whole idea of authorship, and of course I've never signed my work, which was also has been a bother to a lot of people, but
absolutely. I mean, do you want, in 100 years, do you want to be attributed to?
it doesn't matter if I'm not, I'm not. As
It
long
makes it very difficult for scholars if you don't sign.
now
You
with
do
the
not want to be an attribution.
now with the internet, there's tons of stuff on the internet, none of which I've put there. So it's all under my name, and if there's a major power outage over the entire world, well then, they'll...
It isn't correct. What's on the internet?
No. Mm-hmm. Even the Wikipedia, there was a very strange... I learned that there was a Wikipedia entry for me from the 12-year-old that moved in downstairs, and he was very impressed that the person upstairs was in Wikipedia. And so I looked to see, and there was an odd entry there that I quite liked. Unfortunately, I think it was replaced by another organization that thought they were being more formally, and it was not altogether accurate. And I was depressed about that and just didn't look at it anymore. Well, we all have different definitions of preciousness, and jewelry is often defined as the material, the preciousness of the material. That is changing enormously, of course. However, in a general sort of way, that still remains, as it does with this work of mine that is made of paper. But in my view, paper is precious, and it is beautiful, and it is durable if it is taken care of. You have more responsibility as an owner, I guess you could say, with a piece of paper jewelry, because you can't fry Sunday morning bacon in wearing your paper necklace, because the grease will mess it up. And people ask me all the time about wearing it in the rain, and I love that question. And I have yet to just stand in the shower with something on and then let it, and you can see it stays the same. It dries, and it might not be as crisp, but yes, there's a kind of fragility to the paper, but it's incredibly durable. even from studies they've done of, junkyards, and the paper doesn't deteriorate as much as you might think. But the preciousness, the value is in what it holds as an object. Which can be many things. A memory, a gesture, a gift from someone, and value, it's fairly irrelevant to me. Gold is very beautiful, and I would love to work in gold, but the kind of scale that I came to work in, it would be prohibitive. And even silver, I don't value so much as that it's silver as I like the color of silver and working with it and what other things do next to it. So, so that's why I guess I'm not well identified as a jeweler, because I don't always abide by previous rules of metalsmithing.
Do you have any secret pursuits before we end? Is there any secret pursuits of things that you would like to do in the future? Or do you allow those ideas to become part of your thinking as they just appear without any, knowledge?
I have many secret pursuits. I wouldn't call them secret because I couldn't tell you, but there is something
or
to
inner,
not.
Right.
Yeah, there's something to not speaking about it too much. I know the photographer Eve Arnold, when they were asking her about what her work was, she said, "Well, I don't want to let the perfume out of the bottle," and that it sometimes. If I talk too much about an idea, I've made it. Right. And there's no need to make it further. And I think those are good, that's good jewelry too. I want it to be a decorative thing too. Decorating your mind, I always say.
I'm wondering what's going to happen when you're invited to a diamond mine instead of a paper workshop.
Well, I was invited to an amber mine in Poland, and to make.
And did you go?
I thought that would be perfect, and I was very excited. And then. I knew what I was going to do immediately, and then I noticed in the letter that it had taken like 2 months to get to me, and it was past. So I missed that opportunity.
Go to medical school.
Well, it's a good question. My techniques are very, very simple. They're practically primitive, and I consider limitations my most important tools. And I think partly because, not that I'm uneducated or about metalsmithing or techniques, but just that has allowed me to work. That's probably has a lot to do with how I ended up doing what I do. And that you will only learn something as much as you want to learn. And most of the learning is self-teaching, yes, you can learn these tools, but yeah. Well, I think it's unfortunate that we don't have more of apprenticeship kind of situations. That seems very valuable to me, and that I could see as an important way of learning now, because not all people learn in the same way. And yeah.
Well, your journeys have been extraordinary, and I think we have all, really benefited by hearing how you feel about your work, your mission, and certainly the body of work that's here for us today. So I would like to say thank you.
Thank you, Helen.